The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand, and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
In a rather provocative, though always interesting, autobiography called Angela's Ashes, Frank McCourt tells of a confession he made as a young boy once in Limerick. His mother had just given birth to a new baby. Their in-laws from the north of Ireland had sent £5 to buy milk for the new baby. His father, an active alcoholic, had taken the money and goes off drinking it in the pubs. And his mother sends Frank to find his dad and bring him home. He does a tour of the pubs, but he can't find him. But what he finds instead in one pub is a drunken sailor who has fallen asleep. And in front of him is a large plate of fish and chips, which he hasn't touched. So Frank decides to nick the fish and chips and take it outside. He's ravenously hungry. He goes outside and he eats it. But then he begins to feel guilty. And he says he's after stealing, so he decides he better go to confession. So he heads off down to the local Dominican church, and he confesses to the priest that I stole fish and chips from a drunken man. And the priest says, "Well, why did you do that?" Well, he says, "I did that because there's not a scrap of food in the house. My mother is raging at home by the fire, and his father is drinking away the money, but there's no money to buy the milk for the new baby." And the priest, hearing this, suddenly becomes very quiet. And this is what McCourt writes. He says, "Instead of scolding me and giving me a penance, he does something else. He goes very quiet and still. And then he says to me, 'My poor child, I sit here, I hear the sins of the poor, I assign the penance, I bestow absolution. I should be on my knees washing their feet. Go and pray for me. Then he says he blesses me in Latin, talks to himself in English, and I wonder what I did to him. I should be on my knees, washing their feet. These words that the priest spoke are a very beautiful description of one of the central meanings of the Eucharist, what we celebrate here today. Why should we be on our knees, washing other people's feet? Because that's precisely what Jesus did at the Last Supper, at the first Eucharist. And he did it to teach us that the Eucharist is not just a private act of devotion, but it's actually a call, an invitation, and a challenge to serve others. That is what the Mass is meant to do. It's an invitation for you and to me from worshipping and praying, which is essential to develop our interior life, but to shift us too into service, to take the nourishment and the loving embrace that we have received in each Mass from God and translate it into the loving service of others. And that's true whether we hear that call in a beautiful setting like this, surrounded by other members of the Vincentian family, in a large, beautiful place like this, or whether we hear it in the simple quietness of a small country church on a Sunday morning at 8 o'clock. To take the Eucharist seriously is to wash the feet of others, especially the feet of the poor, those who are struggling. And it's not just an invitation that we get that invites us to do that, but it's also the grace we get that empowers us to go out to others. We need the grace because sometimes it's not easy. From where I'm standing, I can see the beautiful stations of the cross here. Before we came in here, we walked around the stations of the cross. Have you ever noticed the stations of the cross are in the present tense? It doesn't say Jesus fell. It says Jesus falls. It doesn't say Jesus met his mother. It says Jesus meets his mother. It's a reminder to us that the Via Dolorosa winds its way through all the streets where we may be living. For many people, we sing of the old rugged cross. For many it may be old and rugged, but it's heavy, it's heartbreaking, and it's here. It's so real. Where I live in St. Peter's Fitzroy in Dublin, our church is in the middle of the road, between two busy streets. And every time we're at daily Mass, our celebrations are punctured by the sound of sirens and blue flashing lights. We have a fire station around the corner. There are ambulances travelling at speed to the nearby Mater Hospital, or otherwise coming the other way from the nearby Mountjoy Jail. There are prison vans with Garda escorts heading to the courts. I don't hear those sounds anymore as interruptions at Mass, but rather as a way of connecting what we're celebrating in the church with the life that's happening outside. Because I think sometimes we can think the Incarnation is a 33-year experiment. You know that Jesus was born, that he lived for 30 years in private, 3 years ministry, that he dies, that he rose, that he ascended. We forget that he's still here. Whenever we gather like this, whenever we gather around the table of the Lamb, the Incarnation comes alive once more. We become what we celebrate. We become the body of Christ. And it touches all of us. We need the head, we need the heart, and we need the hands. We need the head for that vital work of structural analysis and critique of society and its painful injustices, to be a voice for those who have no voice. It's why when the Vincent de Paul makes submissions to the government, we listen because they know what they're speaking about. It's why the vital analysis of the Vincentian Partnership for Justice help us understand what's happening in society. It's also true that many of the people we meet, directly or in pain, they need our heart and they need our hands. I think it's what St. Vincent meant when he issued to his family that lovely challenge. He says, look, remember this, the poor will only forgive what you do for them if they know that you love them. I remember when I worked in London, some of us used to help out at a night shelter near Victoria Station called The Passage. And I recall a young Irish lad who was homeless, and gradually with the help of the staff, they got Michael back on his feet. He got a little job, and he got a little flat in Kentish Town. And one morning at breakfast, one of the priests I lived with was telling me that he had gone in the night before for the midnight shift. And he was horrified to see Michael in the middle of the long queue outside. So he walked down the line, rushed down it. He grabbed Michael by the hand and said, "Michael, what's happened? What are you doing here?" And he said, Michael put up his hand. He said, "Don't worry, Father John." And he smiled at him. He said, "I just came down here to hear someone use my name." It's important for us, isn't it, to see beyond the problem and to see the person. People who are real flesh and blood, to know them by name. The world we live in today is a very complex world. Here in Ireland, many things divide us. Language, race, sexuality, personal history, private wounds, all those things. But it can be challenging in the face of those things sometimes to see people who are different to us as brothers and sisters, as equally important citizens of this world, and as loved and valued by God in the same way we are. When we recognize the presence of Jesus in them, we're being invited to a deeper level of discipleship, of following Jesus. A lady called Mary Byrne lived here, just exactly here in the Basilica in 1879. And she walked Mary McLaughlin, the priest's housekeeper, home on that fateful night in August, and they came upon the scene reflected behind me so beautifully in the mosaic. And Mary was one of the ones who identified St. John. And they said, "Well, how do you know it's St. John?" And she said, "Well, there's a statue like that in the Canvey Church near Lewisburg, further up the coast in County Mayo." And he too was holding a book of the Gospel in his hand. And it's in that Gospel of John, before Jesus washes the feet of his disciples, he does something. Do you remember it says he took off his outer garment? For St. John, when he's describing that, he wasn't just getting rid of a cloth that might get in the way, some outer sash that might block his stooping down and washing someone's feet. What St. John is describing there, in the inner garment of Jesus, is precisely his knowledge that he'd come from God, that he was going from God to God, and that all things were possible for him, because he washed the feet of someone he knew who was going to betray him. This is also true of our inner garment. We sometimes have to shed our outer garment of pride and of prejudice to bend low and help others. Because our inner garment is also an image and the likeness of God inside us. And we too, like Jesus, have come from God, we're returning to God, and therefore we're capable of doing anything, including washing and loving the feet of people who are very different from ourselves. As we gather as the wider Vincentian family, and we welcome everybody here into it today, we're very blessed and even privileged to be able to make that journey and to share it with each other and to support each other on that journey. I like to think that Frederick Osnam, Louise de Maria, or Vincent de Paul would smile down at a gathering like this and say it's good for them to be together. It's good for them too, they would say, to hear again the gospel challenge that Father Pascal read for us this evening. When I was hungry, when I was thirsty, when I was naked, when I was in prison. They would remind us, I think, that as much as we are blessed to wear the mantle of privilege, there's another garment that comes with that we must never forget. The Gospel dramatically reminds us of that. We're invited to reverse, if you like, the value of the world order of things, where pride and status and self-interest seem to be the straw that stirs the drink. Our invitation is to be different. We're invited to exchange the mantle of privilege and embrace the apron of service. Why? Because Jesus said, "For as long as you did it to one of the least of my sisters or brothers, you did it to me."